Guanxiu, night rain. The night rain soaks grass on the hill, where fresh wind blows in dead trees. Slowly I chant an Indian sage's prayer, purer than jade, its clarity. So we continue with poems by Guanxiu. This is a very short one. This is a pentasyllabic quatrain, which is as brief as you can get in classical Chinese poetry. So brief that, this format really brings to mind immediately, like classical Greek epigrams, for example. And with so few words, generally these poems just create an impression. Sometimes, like the first couplet is like more descriptive, and the second one is a witty extension or reflection about the image that was introduced in the first couplet. And sometimes you have to try to see what is the chain that connects one couplet with another one. So I was doubting which poem of Guanxiu's to read as a second option. I had taken a look at another one, Living in the Mountains, which I liked because it was dripping with Buddhist imagery. And as I've mentioned when we've talked about the 300 Tang poems and the negative attitude towards Buddhist poetry from the point of view of the compiler, balancing that out probably requires, reading and giving exemplars of thoroughly Buddhist poetry and subject matter. Living in the Mountains starts with a very famous line, the mind of the mind of the mind is not past sound and sight. But regardless of that, I found this poem more aesthetically satisfactory. This is taken from Charles Egan's Clouds Thick, Whereabouts Unknown, Poems by the Zen Monks of China. And it has a big note on the dead trees image, which we will comment upon on a minute. But anyway, going back to the short poem, like most of classical Chinese poetry, the apparent subject matter on the face of it is just descriptive. We get a sight of nature, and we get not exactly a reaction, but the poetic persona is viewing the scene. So the first couplet, it just describes a scene that could take place at any time. The night rain soaks grass on the hill, where fresh wind blows in dead trees. Of course, it's night rain, so we have to suppose that the poetic persona is awake at night. What is the poetic persona doing awake at night? Maybe they're meditating? That would seem to be the case from the second couplet, or maybe some preoccupation is keeping them awake at night. Anyway, from the vantage point of the poetic persona, a sight of nature, of the landscape, is being shown. So the rain is soaking the grass on the hill, where fresh wind blows in dead trees. So we get night rain, grass being soaked, wind, and blowing into dead trees. I don't think the images, these are different images of nature. I don't think there is any indication of seasonality. Like, rain at night could take place almost in any season, although I imagine it would be more typical, perhaps, of the summer. It could be the autumn as well. Rain falling, I don't know, and soaking the grass. So, that's the literal image. How would you interpret it? I mean, I can imagine lots of ways of trying to read some metaphorical meaning, some human, or in this case, Buddhist theological implications for this rain soaking everything. Is it like the Dharma that soaks all of the world in different ways and manifestations? Or is it like the tears, the lacrimae rerum, the tears of things at mutability and pain and desire? Now that image of the wet, soaked grass under the rain is quite distinct, quite different from the image in the same couplet, but in the second line. Just wind blowing through dead trees. In both images, we get like something going through something else. There's the rainwater falling on the grass, or the wind going through the dead trees. And there the great contrast is with the object of comparison, which is living, ever reappearing grass in the first line, and a dead tree in the second line. So the tree is bigger and the tree is dead, as opposed to the liveliness of grass. So maybe there's this implication of the cycles of nature, of how the living gives way to the dead. How everything just forms a cycle, a wheel, if you wish, a little bit like the wheel of samsara. Anyway, pretty small and pretty few clues or indicators that one can follow to give meaning beyond the literal meaning to this first couplet. Let's see if the second couplet can help us. So, slowly I chant an Indian sage's prayer, purer than jade, its clarity. So the poetic persona is supposed to be awake at night, and a person who is chanting Indian sages' prayers in the night is most obviously a Buddhist monk. Part of the schooling of Buddhist priests and monks would have been learning Sanskrit, which was the Latin of Mahayana Buddhism. And, at least until the Tang, if not later, you could say that Buddhist thinkers, the greatest thinkers and theologians in the tradition, were of Indian origin. In fact, Chan Buddhism is probably the first important sect in Mahayana Buddhism that wasn't actually born in India. It was an endogenous Chinese development. But anyway, we've got the monk chanting slowly the Indian sage's prayer while maybe looking at this landscape described in the first couplet and meditating upon it. And what is the inner state, the mind of the chanter? Well, his image is purer than jade, its clarity. So the first thing this line makes me reflect upon is, what is purer than jade, its clarity? It seems to be the prayer, yeah? So the prayer is purer than jade in its clarity. But again, I have to try to see the imbricature, the connection with the previous couplet. So I imagine that image of the night rain soaking the grass or the fresh wind blowing through the trees is also like the Indian sage's prayer. All of them are extremely clear, characterized by their clarity. Could be that maybe all of them are conveying the same message. Both the prayer and the images of the night rain and the wind blowing in the dead trees. What would be such message? Well, probably, the things I've just mentioned related to the first couplet. Probably, the typical Buddhist messages of the mutability of things, of the cycles of samsara. In the case of the chant, there's also this idea that illumination is not just a rational, logical process of studying the scriptures and getting some intellectual knowledge of the truth, but it's more like something like sudden, not necessarily rational or linguistic, and like the idea that nirvana and samsara are intertwined. They're just seeing the same thing from different perspectives. I mentioned that Mr. Egan has a very long note about the dead tree image that appears in the second line, the wind blowing through the dead trees. And I think probably the note is worth reading, as you might find it enlightening in understanding the imagery of this poem. Dead trees, kummu. The old or dead tree image was briefly described in the introduction. It carries associations of detachment from the world. Old or dead trees have a relative permanence and constancy that flowering vegetation does not. To Chan adherents, the old or dead tree signifies the extinction of attachments, but itself should not be a source of attachment. Carrying the metaphor through, the ideal conclusion is for the dead tree to blossom again. In Transmission 17, Master Tsao Shanbenji says, "Don't you see that the king can manage the affairs of the whole country, and from dead wood blossoms may yet be gathered?" In Blue Cliff 27, Jungmen Wenyang is asked, "When the tree withers and the leaves fall, how is it?" He answers, "The body is revealed by a golden wind." Numerous aphorisms of similar meaning employ the dead tree image, like dead trees, cold ashes. Dead trees by a frozen cliff, 3 winter months without warmth. Blossoms bloom on dead trees in a spring beyond time. And in winter the dead tree blooms. In summer the snowflakes fly. The iron tree, Tieshu, is equivalent. So I would say the message seems to be, or the clarity in the message of nature seems to be, this idea of the detachment from the world that the note is making, permanence and constancy. These ideas, extinction to attachments, but not getting attached to the object that might focalize that idea of extension of attachments. Those would be some of the key ideas that nature, the book of nature, written in Mahayana language, seems to be transmitting to the monk, to Guanxiu, while he's contemplating this scene at night. And, for him, the message that nature is conveying is extremely clear and pure, as clear as his own chanting of Buddhist sutras or prayers.